Hey there everyone, how's it going? Great. This is the first video I'm going to be recording of corrections of models that people send me, as many people ask for feedback, and sometimes it's hard to give feedback just through text or images. I think it's much cooler to take the model, sculpt over it, and talk about how I think when I'm sculpting, how this entire artistic process works, right? It's so complex and very difficult to express it only in images, right? And the model that I will be correcting today, sculpting over, is from our friend Renan Neves from Portugal. Big hug to you, Renan. Thank you for allowing us to share your name, use your model as an example, and let's go for it, right? Well, first of all, it is important to mention that the video is sped up. If you are listening to this video in English, the voiceover is done with AI because the original video I am making is in Portuguese. Right from the start, it is very important to realize that when we begin to study 3D sculpture, particularly focused on anatomy sculpture and such, it is very easy to get lost in the absurd amount of details and smaller volumes because there is so much information within human anatomy. But it is always important to focus on primary and secondary shapes, the larger shapes, the silhouette, and I start with very little reference when I am going to sculpt. It is very important to say that even today, after many years of sculpting, I always sculpt with reference because I do not consider myself a good enough sculptor to create something that satisfies me in terms of quality without reference. And even using a lot of references is something that takes a considerable amount of time for me to achieve a result that I find nice. But what I actually started doing here is working with larger shapes. And I think that when you're just starting out, I see this happening with a lot of people who are beginning, my mentoring students, and people who send me a model like this, right? They send me their work, and the person ends up getting lost in smaller details and forgetting about the primary and secondary shapes. I never had much of this problem while sculpting the model with higher density, but I think this happens a lot when people model with a high dynamesh or a lot of subdivisions. So to avoid that, to really not get caught up in those details, you can use a lower dynamesh or fewer subdivisions. Model with a very light model. You don't need to model like I'm doing, as I like to model with a slightly heavier model because it resembles traditional sculpture a bit more. I don't have a traditional background, but I think I've always ended up modeling this way, and I try to abstract from getting too caught up in small details and everything else, and I try to focus on the larger shapes and the silhouette and how the large volumes are interacting with each other. And if you notice, I started with few references, and then I add references as I find it necessary for each part. And it is very important to remember that since this is a sculpture, you cannot focus too much on just the front view, as this is what causes a lot of structural problems. If you look closely, I'm always rotating the model, looking from different angles. I try not to jump too much from one reference to another. I spend some time on one reference, then move to another, always analyzing from various angles, even unconventional angles, looking from above, from below, and always trying to correct the larger shapes. Even when I'm sculpting, you'll see that. I always start by adjusting my brushes. I always set them to lazy step 0.01, which I think gives a nicer flow. The flow becomes more continuous without those alpha markings, and then I work with a very low intensity. The video is sped up, but if you slow down the video, you'll see that I'm putting it at 60 frames. I use a very low intensity, and as I sculpt, I apply things in a more rough manner, and then I smooth out the shapes with the smooth tool. Since I end up working with the mesh at a higher density, I use the smooth brush on strong. I modify the smooth to use the smooth strong, so that it can really smooth out even when the mesh is denser. So, I really like to use the damage standard to make markings and cuts, right? Then I smooth it out with the smooth tool, and I usually add the volumes with the clay buildup, along with a bit of the standard as well. The total video is about 25 minutes long, but the actual sculpting time was around 1 hour and 37 minutes, 1 hour and 40 minutes, or 1.5 hours. So, to give you an idea, that was a short modeling time, right? We could always push a model much further, but the goal here is to show the main things and not to extend too much on the sculpture. It's not a model that I look at and feel 100% satisfied, but it is a model that has an interesting structure, already incorporating a much more accurate foundation of anatomy than how it started. If you go back there and take a look, you will see that the basic structure is lacking a lot. So this is what I try to do at first, which is to fix the proportion, the distance, the width of the shoulders, looking from the side view, the thickness of the neck, the angle of the incline of the chest, the volume of the chest, the slope of the silhouette seen from the side of the abdomen and the back, always trying to find the S shape that goes from the neck to the back. The body is always made up of many of these S shapes. We see this in the arms, legs, and torso, so it's very important for you to try to find these silhouettes. Always focus on the reference, and if you're having difficulty doing this with the reference beside you, place it above your model. Try to match your model with the reference underneath. You may notice that I added an arm. Our friend's initial model was missing an arm, and I think it's not ideal to just have a short stub at the shoulder. I prefer to extend it a bit more towards the elbow area, as I believe it makes it much easier to visualize the proportion and the flow of the volumes, and how things relate to each other. Because whether we like it or not, the bicep will relate to the shoulder, which will relate to the insertion of the chest. As you can see, as I model, I create another subtool that allows me to go back and check what I've changed, whether I've made a mistake or if I need to go back and redo another part. This is a constant process for me. I always create another subtool to easily go back without having to scroll through history. This way you can analyze well where you've improved. You see that sometimes you sculpt for half an hour, and wow, it makes a huge difference. For me, it's always been like that. Here, with the shapes a bit better defined, I sought to bring out a bit more of the clavicle and correct the shape of the muscles in the neck, starting to sketch a more accurate deltoid, bringing in a bit of the deltoid structure and transitioning the muscle from the chest to the front shoulder muscle. To bring a bit of that fiber separation, I think it's also important to add some information about the nipple there, because if everything is too straight, it can be difficult to make it harmonious when you don't have that information, right? Because when we see a torso, we always see it with a nipple. It's strange not to have one. It's like modeling a face, and sometimes the lack of eyebrows creates a strangeness that you might not even realize is just the absence of an eyebrow on the face, right? This lower part of the abdomen has several nuances, so I try to seek that more curved volume, always sculpting with clay buildup, usually in the direction of the muscle fibers. And take care not to let the abdomen look flat, right? So it's always important to work from the front view, but also take a look from the side and 3/4. You have to keep checking and never get too stuck on just one angle. Here, I also end up hiding the arm, so I don't forget about that lateral part of the abdomen, the serratus, the latissimus, and the back that comes to this more lateral part of the torso, right? And then the back is still looking quite flat, right? It's lacking volume. I will correct this with the move tool, adjusting the silhouette with the move tool, unafraid to change things. I noticed that the belly button is a bit too low. It has a rather unpleasant shape. It's a bit strange, and then I gradually correct it, going by feeling and comparing with the reference, trying to understand what looks off here that I'm looking at and seems weird, and it's all today, with the experience I have, I can understand, it's looking strange because the chest is short, or because the angle of the chest is straight when viewed from below, or because the collarbone is too straight. These things I can say today, not all of them, of course, right? I am always using references precisely for that reason, because not everything is so straightforward to understand why it looks strange. But for the most part, I already know why it looks strange, and I can correct it even if I don't have a reference. However, all of this comes with time, and you need to observe the reference closely to gradually pick it up. So, observation will be the path that will show you where you need to improve your sculpture, you can see that I am using a lot of scan references. This is a very important thing because when you use the scan, in addition to being a real anatomical reference, you are not using the reference of an artistic interpretation. It is realistic. You have all the anatomical information there, and you also have this black and white shading that is very similar to ZBrush, which helps you a lot to see the volumes and interpret the shapes. You can identify how deep the cuts are. You can see that I am also using that photo over there, which is black and white. It helps me see the volumes as well. You need to understand where it is flat, where it is curved, where it is cylindrical, and for all of this, you should use good photos with nice contrast, like this black and white one that I am using a lot, as well as those scan photos over there. Later on, I will take a scan and place it in the viewport to view it from the side alongside my model. And I always do this with an anatomical study that I find very important, because it allows me to see the realistic anatomy that comes from a scan, from angles that you typically won't find photos of on the internet. This is a great insight, and very cool because when you place the scan next to your model in the same proportion, as you rotate your model, you rotate the scan as well, and you always have an excellent reference for the angle you need right next to you. So I think that when you are doing a serious anatomy study, it is very important to have that scan right there. He will help you immensely and provide you with much more information than the photo will give you. However, I also think it's important to note that the photo is very important, because when you are doing things that are not anatomy, you will need to make this translation from 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional. So, knowing how to obtain information about volume and shape from the photo is very important. And here you can see I am using several references for those who know the book Anatomy for Sculptors. For me, this is the most important anatomy book for sculptors. This is the bedside book, and if you're going to buy just one book on art, this is the one I recommend. Dude, this book breaks down everything I'm saying here in this video in a more didactic, easier, and visual way. If you like this video here, try to get this PDF or buy the book instead. In Brazil, it is very difficult to buy. The book is very expensive, but you can easily find the PDF, and it is definitely worth it. You can see that he does the breakdown through illustrations, which gives you a sort of X-ray view of the muscles beneath the skin, allowing you to understand much better where the volume is coming from, because you have the entire illustration representing the muscle, which helps a lot, especially for more complex parts like the serratus, which goes underneath the chest and interacts with the latissimus dorsi and the abdominal muscles. You can see the difference, and in just a short time of sculpting, he was able to make good corrections on the primary and main aspects. And the initial model of our friend Renat, I see many people who are starting to make these mistakes, which is that you see a lack of primary structure, the correct proportion, the correct size of the elements of anatomy, but you already see a lot of attempts to add smaller details, like the abdomen, the serratus, and so on, which are added in a way that I like to exemplify as checkbox modeling. It is not a modeling where you look at the reference, understand it, deconstruct the reference, and then you go and try to replicate that calmly on your model. It's not just that you saw a point or something there, so you have to put something on your model, and then you add that something, and in your mind, according to your artistic vision, it still feels very raw to you, because there's something there and there's something on my model, so it's right. But the thing that's there in the reference is totally different from what you put on your model, right? And how are you going to understand this? Man, you need to take the reference and you need to dissect the reference. For example, now I have started to work more on the arm and other details of the shoulder and everything else. I have already placed the scan in the viewport next to my model. I eliminate the other parts that can distract me and try to maintain roughly the same cut of the torso model that I am sculpting to really focus on where I need to. then you will soon see that I will use more extreme angles, looking from above to correct the shape of the thoracic cage, the shape of the sternum, all these things that Scum presents in a much more explicit way, much easier to see. You see that even when comparing, I have been trying to emphasize more the S shape of the clavicle bone. Now, as I mentioned, I am trying to focus more on these lateral muscles, the suggestions for the insertion of the serratus, and it happens that to create a natural anatomy, a natural anatomical sculpture, and this applies not only to anatomy but to sculpture in general, with an interesting smoothness and nice shapes, you have to work with a light intensity, and you need to go slowly to avoid overdoing it and being too heavy-handed. Because especially in the case of anatomy, we have a lot of... It's all very subtle, so it's very easy to touch there and go beyond. It is difficult to reach the right point when you are studying. You do everything in a hurry and use the brush very intensely, right? It's always good to lower the intensity, set the laser step high there to make sculpting really enjoyable. The low laser step number in this case, right? I use 0.01. And then you come in with a low intensity, like 4, 2, 3 on the clay buildup, and you sculpt calmly, very relaxed. And if you want to see how I sculpt better, slow down the video, right? I'm going to set the video to 60 frames so you can slow it down and watch it more calmly. Because when it's sped up like this, it looks like I'm modeling frantically, but in reality I model quite slowly. The video is about 4 times faster than normal, so the speed at which I actually model is much slower. And finding those volumes, you try and it doesn't turn out well, then you soften it and try again. It's not a game, it's a play. Over time you will start to understand these volumes more easily, and you will reach them more quickly. As I said, at the end of this video, there will be an interesting result, but the study of anatomy has no end. You can deepen any study. It is eternal. There is always something to improve. Even more so, this was a sculpture that took about an hour and a half, so it was quite quick. Imagine if we spent 5 or 8 hours sculpting, we would already achieve a much better result. Now imagine doing a study for 2 days, for example, which I think is a good amount of time for a study. A 2-day study for a torso can yield a really nice result, even when you are just starting your studies or are at a primary level of anatomy. In 2 days of study, you will already be able to achieve a much better result. Here is the final result. I hope this video has helped you in some way to better understand how to sculpt or how to improve the way you take references and study anatomy. If you have a model that you would like me to make a correction video on, you can send it to my email at gabrielbonadesign.com, and in the future I can get in touch with you to let you know that I will be recording a correction video based on your model. Thanks everyone, take care, and happy studying.